Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for coming to our Gaza lecture series. This is a series that is approaching our second year anniversary. It's a series that has been co-sponsored by six different units here at Georgetown University. I want to begin by giving a shout out to students and faculty at St. Joseph University in Philadelphia, who I hope are joining us today on Zoom. St. Joseph University has been staging public live screening events of our Gaza lecture series since its inception. We're happy to learn that other universities are doing this. I was informed on Friday, however, that this particular lecture was canceled at St. Joseph University because of extreme external pressure put on the university and senior university officials to cancel the lecture by Jason Stanley. I was even told by colleagues that the Zoom link for today's lecture could not even be circulated to students. This is, of course, a grotesque crackdown on freedom of expression and academic freedom, but it's also a sign of our times. Free speech and academic freedom are under severe assault here in this country. Of course, it mostly revolves around the question of Palestine, and I'm really hoping that students and faculty at St. Joseph University can mobilize to push back against these intimidation tactics that are corrupting and corroding what's left of our democracy here in the United States. In this context, I want to say that we're incredibly lucky here at Georgetown University to have the support of senior administrators. It would be wrong for me to say that it was 100% support, but nonetheless, it's solid support and we deeply appreciate it nonetheless. So it's a huge honor today to host Jason Stanley on our campus. Jason is a philosopher whose work ranges over the philosophy of language, epistemology, linguistics, cognitive science, and social and political philosophy. Currently, he is the Bissell Haig Chair in American Studies at the Munk School, Global Affairs and Public Policy at the University of Toronto. He also has an appointment in the Department of Philosophy. Jason has authored 7 books, which have been translated into 30 languages, most recently How Fascism Works, The Politics of Them and Us, and Erasing History, How Fascists Rewrite the Past to Control the Future. In addition to his academic work, Jason is a public intellectual who writes for broader audiences on themes of authoritarianism, propaganda, free speech, mass incarceration, and democracy for publications such as the New York Times, The Guardian, and Zeteo. And for over a decade, he was a professor of philosophy at Yale University. Earlier this year, he announced he was moving to the University of Toronto at a reduced salary because of what he perceived to be America's descent into fascism. Quote, "I'll be in a much better position to fight bullies," he was quoted as saying, as to why he's moving to Canada. In a recent essay in Zeteo, he wrote, quote, "What pushed me over the edge was Columbia University's decision to agree to Trump administration demands over charges of anti-Semitism. Columbia's deal with the Trump regime threatened to be a model for the capitulation of American universities to fascism," end quote. These are obvious perilous times for our democracy, for our world, for universities, for those of us who care about human rights, democracy, and international law. When thinking about a scholar who could speak to us today on the relationship between the genocide in Gaza, the broad theme of liberalism, and the legacy of anti-Semitism, I couldn't think of a better expert to invite to our lecture series than Jason Stanley. Jason, it's an understatement to say that I wish we were meeting under better circumstances, but nonetheless, it's a huge honor to have you on our campus today to speak on the topic of the legacy of genocide. Please join me in welcoming to Georgetown, Jason Stanley.
So I'm going to cover a bunch of themes today. One of the things that's going to be tricky about listening to a philosopher talk in these times of enormous emergency is that philosophy is very abstracted. Even philosophy about these emergency times is very abstracted. So there's a risk of doing theory with people's lives. And during genocidal times, that is a particularly strong risk. But I am a philosopher. And so what I can do is I can break down ideas and give you structures that will enable you to think through the current moment. But in terms of I'll say some things about why plans for action are so difficult in this historical moment. But generally, I will run the risk of doing theory with people's lives, and it's hard to do philosophy during these times for that reason. But I'm going to talk about some of the things that I think would help people get conceptually during these times in order to argue for justice, because that's what I can do. And that includes talking about the structures of anti-Semitism, which we're seeing flying around a lot lately in unexpected places. So I'm an analytic. So first, I should say a little bit of. I'm going to say a lot about how I started thinking and writing about Gaza. I started my first work as a public intellectual was a New York Times piece in 2011 on birtherism, and I started publishing on Gaza in 2014. So I've been publishing on Gaza as long as I've been a public intellectual, basically. So I'm going to say a little bit about why. So I am an analytic philosopher. More specifically, a philosopher of language. And my work is in linguistics and philosophy of language for the most part, as well as epistemology. And I've been working on the topic of propaganda since 2010. So 15 years. In 2015, I published a book, How Propaganda Works, and a lot of it was on topics. It was about political speech, propaganda in education, propaganda in ordinary discourse. So this project, even my 2015 book, talks a lot about fascist propaganda, genocidal propaganda, and one of its central examples is the propaganda that led to and justified U.S. racial mass incarceration. So I soon realized linguistics needed novel tools to explain the causal effect of dehumanizing speech. What we need to understand as scientists is how is it that rhetoric and narrative structures justify violence? What's not just justify, but causally influence violence? That to me is the subject of my scientific work and has been for the last couple decades. So it is in this context that I have been engaged as a scholar with today's issues. Because if you're working on fascism, on genocidal speech, on anti-Semitism, on Islamophobia, on racism, particularly the issue of the Gaza genocide and the issues of Israeli apartheid and justifications for Israeli apartheid come up. Already in How Propaganda Works, I had analyses of Frank Luntz's Israel Project report. It's just my job as a scientist. That's what I do, is I look at propaganda. So much of this work has been abstract, trying to broaden the tools of the theory of meaning to make generalizations about patterns. That's the structure. That's some of the structure you're going to see here. And I've mixed this work, this highly abstract work, with very detailed work, with personal reflections on my own family history. First of all, my mother was a court stenographer in Manhattan Criminal Court for 33 years, including during the Central Park 5 case. So I heard a lot about American racism. My mother said to me at the time, they're going to kill all the Black people in this country, because she's a Holocaust survivor. She lived in Poland from ages 5 to 8 after World War II, the era about which Jan Grosz writes his book Fear, when they were killing and targeting returning Jews returning from the Gulag. And my mother, my mother and father both experienced terrible things in Europe. So the topic of mass incarceration figures in my work quite centrally, even in the most abstract theory. And my parents' experiences in the European Holocaust figures even more centrally. And I should say something about, which emerges in my work on this topic. I'm extremely Jewish. What does that even mean? I'm like, it's very central to my identity. And I'm going to talk about the ways in which it's central to my identity in what follows. But my Jewish identity is not connected to the state of Israel. I was there once to give a lecture at Hebrew University in the philosophy department. I think I talked about conditionals. But I don't have, my Jewish identity has to do with genocide, with the Holocaust, and with a legacy of Christian oppression in Europe. So that's, and Jewish holidays and, the Jewish practices. But it's not connected to Israel. In fact, my Jewish identity makes me struggle with, the kind of structures that tell me that it has to be connected to Israel. My connection has more to do my Jewish connection identity has to do with the fact that my grandmother saved 412 people from concentration camps, and my mother and I lost my mother and her sister are the only survivors of their generation. So I'm in no sense a scholar of the Middle East, but I've always recognized Israel's war crimes. First publishing about the topic in Frankfurter Allgemeine Zeitung during Israel's 2014 bombing of Gaza, at the very beginning of my career as a public-facing scholar. In a New York Times essay in 2016, my parents' mixed messages on the Holocaust. I write this about my childhood, and this is really the first time I got in trouble. My father's reaction to describing him as a Holocaust survivor was more severe. He angrily questioned my motivations. Was I seeking a special status as a victim? He urged me to reflect about how offensive this is to those who have to actually live under oppression. He argued powerfully against the stance of the victim. It was morally dangerous, he said, using the actions of Israelis and Palestinians toward one another as an example. He was scornful when he saw signs that I was taking the Holocaust to mean that Jews were special. If the Germans had chosen someone else, he often said, we would have been the very best Nazis. That line got me in a great deal of trouble. But it was what he said. Was I supposed to laugh? And my father is the grandson of the head cantor of the Fascism synagogue. Leo Back was the rabbi. So he was the Oberkantor from 1912 to 1938 to Kristallnacht, my great-grandfather, one of the most important synagogues in Germany. And Joseph Goebbels personally gave the order to burn it down on Kristallnacht, as Goebbels says in his diary. And my grandmother went into Sachsenhausen dressed as a Nazi social worker to rescue 412 people over several years. And then my father got out of Germany in late July 1939 at the age of 6 with his mother to New York. And he spent his life thinking about what leads to fascism and genocide in his career. So in that same essay, I continue, my father was always critical of Israel's policies toward Palestinians, convinced that the establishment of the state of Israel was implicated in the horrors of colonialism. He worked on colonialism as a scholar. He was equally abhorrent of Palestinian violence against Israeli citizens, generally of violence, against innocents. I grew up hearing other American Jews speak of Palestinians in pre-genocidal ways, that Palestinians have always wanted to kill the Jews and must therefore be kept locked away and controlled. Regular exposure to such talk has made me permanently afraid for the safety of the Palestinian people. So I said this in 2016 in the New York Times. Now, by this time, I had been working for years on the topic of genocidal speech and had written a 300-page book about it for Princeton. So it's simply impossible to do that theoretical work. You can't work on genocidal speech without clearly recognizing the following fact. In every Jewish community, there are many people who speak in explicitly genocidal ways about Palestinians and have always done so my whole life. So every Jewish American knows this. So Now, there are plenty of Jewish Americans who do not speak this way. But hearing explicit justifications for genocide, crucial to establishing intent, has been a normal part of American Jewish lives as long as I can remember. And more recently, new genocidal tropes have been introduced that have had an impact among American Jews, such as Netanyahu's claim that in a 2015 speech to the World Zionist Congress that Hitler didn't want to kill the Jews, but was convinced by Jerusalem's Grand Mufti to kill them rather than allow them to leave to Palestine. Here, Netanyahu is saying that the Palestinians are the true agents of the Holocaust. This is genocidal speech. It's saying you can kill them because of, look at, they are true enemies. Among the people who describe, now here is a note, some note, of caution, of complexity, because I'm going to be talking about the relationship between liberalism and Zionism later in this talk. But I want to say that do not confuse the category of self-described Zionist with person who engages in explicitly genocidal talk. And the word genocide as a result has to be made more, what's happening in Gaza right now is a genocide. I think we have to be, and there's plenty of explicitly genocidal talk that has been happening, as I said, in every American Jewish community. But there are lots of people who are Zionists who would never talk that way. So they would never say Palestinians are, should have no business existing. Palestinians are just Arabs who should be shoved into other lands. There are plenty of people who say I'm a Zionist and who reject that talk. And so, there are philosophical questions about the relationship between liberalism and Zionism that I will get to. And I do think that, I do agree with Edward Said when he writes, the Jewish state is built in many but not all ways on negation of Palestine and Palestinians. And it's hard to deny Said's claim that the Arab expressed whatever by definition stood outside beyond Zionism. These are hard to deny. But there are real differences that matter to justice between people who call themselves Zionists and people who speak in explicitly genocidal ways about Palestinians. And every Jewish American knows this. And so, I'm in Ukraine twice a year because I have a position at the Kyiv School of Economics. And one of the things that people do is they want to fight a battle. They want to fight against Russia to litigate everything. They want it to be a moment where people can say the Soviet Union was the real problem. And I try to say, it's not the time to talk about Stalin. It's not the time right now. Like, you're going to lose an audience. You're going to lose effectiveness if you make this a moment to litigate everything, like every harm Ukraine has had back to Holodomor. And so that's been a struggle in Ukraine, and I can see why it's a struggle here. But as I said, we have a genocide happening now. It must stop, and we must get to the point where we can recognize how, we can recognize that we've had apartheid, we've had structures of injustice, but that does not mean litigating everything. And there's this wide diversity of views. So setting up people, you're losing potential allies for a just resolution. And if you just say, okay, this is just all Zionism. So I'm not a scholar of the Middle East in no way, but I am a scholar of U.S. mass incarceration. I regularly teach the work of Angela Davis in my classes, and she is an exception. Angela Davis is an exceptionally clear and persuasive philosopher. Angela Davis is, of course, Marcuse's student, a central figure in the Frankfurt School, which is a tradition. So people are saying, you can't talk about fascism, you're not a historian. Well, the 20th century philosophy is there's a huge vein of 20th century philosophy that's devoted to talking about fascism, who are not historians. People like Hannah Arendt, Adorno, Horkheimer, Marcuse, all of whom were philosophers and not historians. So I take myself to be in that tradition, but not as much as Angela Davis is in that tradition. She is a Frankfurt School scholar who's also, of course, who's bringing U.S. and international history into that structure, also deeply affected by the Black radical tradition in the United States. So it's really impossible, because Davis is such a clear thinker, I find, to deny the connections she draws between the apartheid regimes in different countries. For instance, in her 2013 speech on Palestine, G4S, and the prison industrial complex, she draws economic connections between the forces profiting off these regimes, private prison structures like G4S. It's really impossible, I've found, to engage seriously with her work and thought without clearly recognizing these parallels facing peoples oppressed by generational apartheid. And through Kim Crenshaw's work, I learned about the ways in which superficially neutral laws could be structurally discriminatory against certain populations, for example, Black women. More generally, critical race theory studies how superficially neutral laws can structurally discriminate against a racial group in favor of a dominant racial group in the United States, of course, white Americans. In the vein of critical race theory, in his 2018 speech to the United Nations, Our Solidarity Must Become a Verb, Mark Lamont Hill writes, at the current moment, there are more than 60 Israeli laws that deny Palestinians full access to full citizenship rights simply because they're not Jewish. From housing education to family reunifications, it is clear that any freedoms naturally endowed to all human beings are being actively stripped away from Palestinians through Israeli statecraft. This is also obviously true in what I study, which is linguistic practices. So I look at an ideology is structured, racial ideology, ideologies behind apartheid regimes, are structured also in terms of speech practices. Speech practices are central to those ideologies. And that's the aspect of ideologies that I study in my work. And you can see these overlaps with the strategic use of terrorist, thug, or criminal as strategies, linguistic strategies to dehumanize across apartheid regimes. And a recent book by Dr. Hadil Abu Hussein, The Struggle for Land Under Israeli Law, An Architecture of Exclusion, is a kind of in-depth dive into the history of Israeli land law and how it created this second-class citizenship for Palestinians. And I learned a lot from Dr. Hadil Abu Hussein's book about the sort of detail of which, say, Said in the question of Palestine will give you a general structure and general hints to. So I'm really indebted to the literature in the Black radical tradition for theoretically cementing the profound overlaps between the U.S. racial regimes and what Israel is doing for the Palestinian people. Now, the topic of my latest book, my 2024 book, Erasing History, is how fascism strategically erases history to justify its continued crimes. Like the topic of multi-generational apartheid, you cannot speak about this without talking about what has happened to the Palestinian people. We don't need to litigate whether or not a country is settler colonialist. This is another problem I have with the discourse. I mean, the United States is settler colonialist. Canada is settler colonialist. There are lots of settler colonialist countries. You can't kill innocent people just because they're settlers, they're settler colonialists, because none of us wants our kids to be killed by Indigenous Canadians and Americans. That's morally reprehensible. So I don't love but it also, like Ned Blackhawk in his National Book Award-winning book, shows very clearly that indigenous people in the United States regularly engaged in settler colonialist. There were indigenous empires in the United States, and they regularly engaged in settler colonialist practice against each other. So, indigenous people regularly conquer other people's land, drive them off, kill them. But it's unquestionable that Israel employs classically dehumanizing colonialist strategies against the Palestinians. This is not a open to rational debate. I think, you can talk. So while I think it's, lots of countries are settler colonialist, Israel is engaging in absolutely deplorable dehumanizing tactics against the Palestinian people that are colonialist practices, and deplorable because they're colonialist. And so you would expect all these structures that you find in the literature on fascism, from Césaire to Arendt, that colonialism is going to lead to, a leader of your country who's been in power for multiple decades, and to fascism. So in a process known as Judaization of the space, Arabs are forced off their land by spurious legal excuse, and the land is occupied by Israeli Jews, with Arab villages literally erased from the landscape, taken down stone by stone. Said gives as an example the emergency defense regulations, which, quote, were used to expropriate thousands of acres of Arab lands, either by declaring Arab property to be in a security zone or by ruling lands to be absentee property, even if in many cases the absentees were present, a legal fiction of Kafkaesque subtlety. And for sort of really bearing down on this, Hadil Abu Hussein's book is really good in terms of the details. So in erasing history, I use as paradigm examples of the kind of dehumanizing narratives, the ways in which erasing the history of Palestinian people and perspectives has been central to the construction of Israeli national myth, and has played a role in the brutal actions against the Palestinian people. So those who dispute that Israel's national myth is settler colonialist focus on establishing that there has been a lengthy Jewish presence in the broader Middle East, or that in the distant past, Israel was populated by Jews. And I wouldn't dispute either of these facts. These are facts. But the fact that Jewish people, or many Jewish people, are in various senses indigenous to the general region of the Middle East, and even originally indigenous to Israel, is simply not relevant to the issue of settler colonialism. And if you find yourself bogged down in that discussion, it's worth emphasizing. As Said writes, all the constitutive energies of Zionism were premised on the excluded presence, that is, the functional absence of native people in Palestine. Institutions were built deliberately shutting out the natives. Laws were drafted when Israel came into being that made sure the natives remain in their non-place, Jews in theirs, and so on. It is no wonder that today the one issue that electrifies Israel as a society is the problem of the Palestinians, whose negation is the most consistent thread running through Zionism. Zionism from the standpoint of its victims. Pretending that a people with equal rights to the land never existed, have no history, is the basis of settler colonialist ideology. So it doesn't matter that we can trace our history back to that land. If you're pretending that another people does not exist that lived there, that's settler colonialist ideology. If Europeans had left the United States in 2,000 years ago and then returned and committed a genocide of the indigenous people and drove them out the land, it still would be settler colonialism. So now, when I told a friend of mine, a fellow academic who has not spoken or written about Gaza, about this talk here today, so what are our structures that, this is now I'm shifting into the structures that have prevented academics or allow academics to justify not talking about this. My own view is that all Jewish Americans should speak about on this topic. When I told a friend of mine, a fellow Jewish academic who has not spoken or written about Gaza, about this talk here today, they asked how I could speak about it when I am not a scholar of Palestinian history or literature. They added, "You have never even been to Gaza. How can you speak about a conflict without having even visited the place?" I'm sure this academic is sincere. They're a friend of mine. Such attitudes are part of the psychological structure academics use to justify themselves, their silence in the face of genocide. They say to themselves, I'm actually being responsible as an academic. In fact, this person was trying to guilt me. They were trying to say, you should feel guilty for speaking about something that you're not a scholar of. And in fact, I am heroically maintaining my scholarly credentials by refusing to speak about this. This shows you how the structures of justification are buttressed by having a PhD. The fact is, the fact is, we don't need archives to be in archives right now because we have a living archive on our phones. So we can all educate ourselves right now. It is hard to draw, but there are serious obstacles to action in the current moment. It's hard drawing on history to understand what to do in the face of Israel's genocide in Gaza. It poses a daunting obstacle to action. I was raised as a child of the European genocide of my people with the story of the heroic Jan Karski, a courier for the underground Polish Home Army. He was brutally tortured by the Nazi regime. And then after he survived that, with the help of the Bundist Leon Feiner, he made his way into the Warsaw Ghetto twice, as well as penetrating the death camp system. He escaped a brutal fate in order to smuggle the information he gathered to Allied leaders, including President Roosevelt. His eyewitness accounts were not believed, but his story of heroism is legendary. Karski's example has always given the moral. I mean, the moral of Karski is like, you have to get the information out. But what do we do now when the information is already out? So the whole thing, the whole structure of what we're supposed to do in the face of genocide is somehow smuggle out the information that is happening. Guess what? The information has been smuggled out. And it's that, so we're watching the only live feed genocide that we've seen. So, okay, in a piece I published in 2022 in Project Syndicate, The Genocidal Identity, I bring my theoretical work on communication to the topic of a particular kind of social identity, one that is based on an extreme version of a friend-enemy distinction, such as Aryan identity and Nazi ideology, which was existentially committed to the genocide of Jewish people. So as part of its very nature and definition. I argued that such an identity had terrible ramifications for one's descendants, trapping them into a binary choice between family loyalty and justice. So if you face that, if you're occupying an identity that says, okay, it is crucial to, this group committed these terrible acts and they are my family, they are my people, I have to be loyal to them. That kind of identity traps your descendants into thinking, am I going to be loyal to my ancestors or am I going to answer things about justice? And that's a very difficult place to be. Germans have always struggled with it. I live in Germany a lot. I lived there as a teenager. It's very difficult for Germans to struggle with, and it's not something you should do to your descendants, obviously. Now, in this essay, I also spoke about the Russian nationalist identity behind the war of aggression Russia is waging in Ukraine. This identity also threatens to be genocidal, as predicated on the negation of Ukrainian identity, whose very existence is presented as an existential threat. And there are differences between the two cases. Nazis did not regard Jewish identity as fake. They regarded it as utterly real. In contrast, in the ideology of Russian nationalism, Ukrainian identity is fake. But both ideologies represent these identities as existential threats. There is, of course, nothing wrong with having a social identity. In fact, um, as I've argued with David Beaver in our 2023 book, The Politics of Language, which I'll be discussing tomorrow at George Washington, it's impossible to communicate without communicating a social identity. You have to have a social identity. Think words carry social identities with them. Think of professor, bifocals, therapist, hiker. But certain social identities are anti-democratic by nature. Social identities that exclude the perspectives of certain groups. And because they can be used to justify apartheid, second-class citizenship, structures that are anti-democratic, anti-liberal. The social identity of being Jewish is not in any sense problematic in this way. The social identity of being Jewish is not predicated on the erasure of any other group. I can proudly be a Jewish person and have it in no sense be connected to the erasure of anyone else, well, especially not my mother. The social identity of being a Jewish person far preceded Zionism. Furthermore, even after the emergence of Zionism as a political ideology in the 20th century, there were powerful anti-Zionist movements such as the Jewish Bund, a story laid out in Molly Crabapple's evocatively titled forthcoming book. Here Where We Live is Our Country, which is, in contrast, as Said and others have emphasized, the social identity of being an Israeli, its national myths, are predicated on the elimination or erasure of Palestinians as a people. These distinctions entail that the social identity of being a Jew is completely independent of the social identity of being an Israeli. In no way, shape, or form does one have to erase any other group in order to fully occupy the identity of being Jewish, in order to, not celebrate Christmas, only have Jewish holidays, etc. Being Jewish and being Israeli are two completely separate identities. Insofar as Israeli nationalist myth forms Zionist ideology, it follows that being Jewish and being Zionist are completely separate identities. Perhaps in this sense, one can even say that Zionism has contributed not just to Palestinian erasure, but also of Jewish erasure. My identity as a Jew is connected to the Holocaust, and it's connected to liberalism. And that identity leads me to want to stand up for any group that suffers the apartheid we suffered in Europe for well over 1,500 years from the Christians. Now, liberal Zionism tries to marry two traditions, liberalism and Zionism, that are prima facie inconsistent. Think of, for example, if someone told you they were a liberal Christian Zionist, think if someone told you they were a liberal Christian nationalist or a liberal Hindu nationalist, you would say that doesn't make any sense. So there's a real problem for those who would represent themselves as liberal Zionists. It's a conceptual problem, and I'm a philosopher. This is what I deal with. So one would need to elucidate any. It's widely held that there can be a marriage of liberalism and nationalism. You can have liberal nationalist projects, but the nationalism has to be civic. The nationalism can't be ethnically or religiously based. As a political philosopher, I think it's probably 101 that you can't have a liberal version of an ethnically or religiously based nationalism. It's not a controversial, not like wildly, oh my God, Professor Stanley said something anti-Semitic. It's just 101 liberalism. Now, that's not to say you can't have civic nationalism. This is an ongoing debate. So this is the challenge for liberal Zionism. How to elucidate a version of Jewish nationalism that can be liberal. When we're aware that there can't be Christian nationalism that can be liberal or Hindu nationalism that can be liberal. This is an obviously hard philosophical project. It is this perhaps for this reason that the humanist and universalist rhetoric of liberal Zionism is such a powerful method to conceal the most fundamentally illiberal concept, that of a hierarchy of value. So the opposite, the opposite value of liberalism is hierarchies about moral value between humans. As Simone Zimmerman writes in her powerful piece, Rhetoric Without Reckoning, Jewish Currents, August 2025, all of this rhetoric betrays the clear hierarchy of the value of human life endemic to Zionism. So she's talking about the sort of humanist liberal rhetoric, because when only the logic that Jewish death is unacceptable and Palestinian death is a tragic necessity can explain the way these leaders remained ensconced in a story about Jewish victimhood as Gaza burned. Now, from a personal standpoint, I'm deeply offended by the claim that anyone who rejects a blood and soil conception of citizenship, a conception of citizenship that says, you come from this land originally, so you can come back, you have Jewish ethnicity, you're religious or ethnically connected, so you belong to this land. So I'm really concerned, I'm really offended by the claim that anyone who rejects such a conception of citizenship is could be anti-Semitic. Because we were killed in the Holocaust because we were supposedly the force behind liberalism. We were killed in the Holocaust because, read Mein Kampf and you will see why Hitler hated us. He hated us not because we went to shul, not because we had religious practices, but because we were supposedly the force behind liberalism, Marxism, and feminism. And we threatened a blood and soil conception of citizenship. Here is a passage about liberalism from the incredibly toxic and incredibly influential anti-Semitic tract of 1903, The Protocols of the Learned Elders of Zion. It's on your handout. Political freedom is an idea, but not a fact. This idea one must know how to apply whenever it appears necessary with this fate of an idea to attract the masses of the people to one's party for the purpose of crushing another who is in authority. This task is rendered easier if the opponent has himself been infected with the idea of freedom, so-called liberalism. The anti-Semitism of the protocols becomes Nazi anti-Semitism, and it's exactly Hitler's anti-Semitism in Mein Kampf. The idea is that Jews are promoting liberalism to weaken Aryans into accepting equality, human equality. So the idea then to tell me that I'm anti-Semitic because I oppose illiberalism is horrifying. To denounce the liberal view that rejects various versions of nationalism, to say that liberalism, because it says you can't have an ethnically or religiously based conception of citizenship, that any version of liberalism is anti-Semitic, is a perverse demonization of my people. After all, the Nazis were the other group who demonized liberal humanist Jews as existential threats. I am part of a genuinely liberal tradition in Judaism. In my father's work on education, he describes a concept he calls civic compassion. He writes, as the history of Western totalitarianism has taught us, the ultimate test of compassion is civic defense, the stance of citizens towards each other as civil neighbors, far and wide, who will not abandon people to avoidable suffering or to murderers. Much less demanding tests are failed. However, before this final test is reached, how may we articulate what is meant sociologically by civil compassion? So my father is saying the ultimate test of compassion, which should be rather minimal, is not letting people be murdered. Identifying the goal of civic education as the nurturing of civil compassion. He defines civic compassion, he defines civic education, the goal of civic education is, quote, bringing people to the point of understanding the objective historical and existing conditions of groups with whom they have had no personal life experience. My father was here giving voice to a liberalism that he carried down to me through his German Jewish and then New York Jewish identity. Liberalism is based on understanding the material conditions of groups mutually impacted by national policies, which is the path towards the core Kantian ideal of equal dignity. At the root of liberalism is not free markets; it's equal human dignity, and that doesn't mean that you have to have a unity or solidarity. This is the thing my father's pushing against. He's saying you have to understand the material conditions of other human beings impacted and this was the conception of Judaism I grew up with as liberalism. And so the guiding ethos of the liberal Jewish and I should say this is a long-standing issue in Judaism. It goes to the very core of Jewish life, this distinction between universalist conceptions of Judaism and particularist conceptions. The universalist conception says our history of slavery and dispossession is immoral for everyone. And then the particularist conception is, no, it's just about the Jews. It's just about our group. And so to say that anyone who holds the universalist conception of the morals of our history is an anti-Semite is abhorrent. It's anti-Semitic, really. Because these are two parts of Jewish history. Think of the Passover Seder. It can be taught as slavery and escaping from slavery for anyone, or it can be talked about, look at us, and let's not have that happen to us again. The guiding ethos of the liberal Jewish tradition, and this is what I'll conclude on, in which my father raised me, echoes through Ghassan Kanafani's classic novella, Returning to Haifa. To remind you of that novella, Said and his wife Safia returned to Haifa 20 years after they were driven out in April 1948, forced to leave their infant son behind. Returning to their house, they meet its current owners, Miriam, who took over the house with her husband Efrat when Said and Safia were forced out. Even more horrifyingly, Said and Safia's son was adopted and raised by Miriam and her husband. Miriam and her husband are Holocaust survivors. They profit directly and in profoundly disturbing ways from the Nakba. But Kanafani represents them with tremendous passion. Describing a scene in which Miriam witnesses the brutal treatment of a murdered Arab child, he writes, she saw two young men from the Haganah carrying something, which they put in a small truck nearby. In a flash, she saw what it was that they were carrying. She grabbed her husband's arms and, trembling, cried out, "Look!" But her husband didn't see anything when he looked where she was pointing. The two men were wiping their palms on the sides of their khaki shirts. She said to her husband, "That was a dead Arab child. I saw it, and it was covered with blood." Her husband guided her across the street, then asked, "How did you know it was an Arab child?" "Didn't you see how they threw it onto the truck like a piece of wood? If it had been a Jewish child, they would never have done that." He wanted to ask her why, but when he saw her face, he remained silent. Miriam had lost her father at Auschwitz 8 years before. When they raised, when they were at, I mistyped this. When they're at the house where he lived with, where she lived with her husband, he wasn't home, so she took refuge with the upstairs neighbors. The German soldiers didn't find anyone, but on their way back down the stairs, they came upon her 10-year-old brother, who most likely had been on his way to tell her that their father had been sent to the camps, leaving him all alone. When he saw the German soldiers, he turned and began running away. She saw it all through the narrow slit made by a short gap between the stairs. She also saw how they shot him down. This passage, of course, exhibits compassion for Miriam's own experience as a victim of the Holocaust. But that's not what I want to talk about. That's not what I want to draw your attention to. I want to draw your attention to something else in Kanafani's passage, representation of Miriam. He represents Miriam as having a shock of recognition of the situation via her sense of mutual human recognition. In other words, Kanafani is giving Miriam human dignity, a capacity for shock, the murder of others. It's not expressing compassion for her experience in the Holocaust. It's not just that. It's much more profoundly, he's saying Miriam is a human agent. Miriam is a human with equal dignity, and because Miriam recognizes the dignity of other human life. That is liberalism, when you recognize other people as having full human dignity. That is what Kant called upon us to do as human beings. Across American Jewish discourse, Palestinians are often represented as lacking in any kind of compassion for Jews. People represent, and this is also, I should say, why I find it horrific for people who, I mean, compassion is required for everyone. Victims are Palestinian or Jewish, but American Jewish discourse will often represent Palestinians as not having compassion for Jews. And that is just not true when you look at, that's dehumanizing, to represent Palestinians as not having compassion for other human beings. That itself is dehumanizing. And it justifies treating them with violence. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jason. I'm going to pose the first question, and then we'll open it up to the audience. Look, there's a lot of things that you said here that really resonated. I think the one that sort of stands out in my mind is the challenge of how do we deal with the struggle between our universalist sort of conceptions of our religious, ethnic identity that we come from, and the particularist sort of interpretations that exist in all religious traditions.
Right.
This is always a contest and battle. So everything that you were saying about Zionism and the Jewish community resonates with my own sort of experience within the Muslim community. Same type of battles. How do we fight those battles to sort of come up with more universalist, inclusive interpretations of our religious and ethnic identity, while at the same time being true to that identity and not sort of being shunned from the community? I mean, that's sort of...
Well, this is an easy one.
Easy one.
Yeah. Well, the thing about Judaism that, for all I know, might be special is that it's part of the damn religion.
Yeah.
It's part of my religion that there is that struggle. Like, it goes to the Passover Seder. It goes, like, part of Judaism. This is why it's so horrific to say that Jews like me, who have that universalist conception of Judaism, are anti-Semitic. Because it is just central to the religion that there's this long argument, thousands-year-long argument about the universalist, about does Judaism represent abhorrence to slavery, abhorrence to apartheid, generally, or is it just about saving ourselves? So I think there's a thing about being Jewish that enables you to say, okay, well, this is an old argument, and actually having this argument is central to Judaism. I don't know if, say, Christianity, I mean, Christianity obviously has this weird universalist component that but you have to convert people, or it depends on the type of Christianity, of course. But I don't know Islam to speak about. I can't speak about how this struggle is going to work, how you would get. But to me, there's very clear grounds for a universalist, for Jewish liberalism, and a Jewish version of saying, okay, you shouldn't have a state based on, I mean, I think one thing I do in the case of my identity is I say, look, we were oppressed for 1,500 years in until the 19th century, we lived in an apartheid state in Europe. And we fought for liberalism. That was like our thing. Like you shouldn't have the state shouldn't be Christian. We are at home wherever we are. So if you can draw on that history of apartheid and exclusion, then you have a weapon. You say, look at what we experienced.
Yeah. Okay, great. I mean, this is a huge topic, obviously.
Yeah.
I don't want to dominate the discussion. We'll go to Laith at the back for the first question.
Thank you so much for your talk. I wanted to ask, over the last few weeks, we've had discussions at the center and with other talks about a sort of a unified or an alternate Palestinian leadership that is able to represent and to push this sort of, push the Palestinian cause to a way where there's a solution. And I'm hearing you talk about a lot of the things that you're saying makes me wonder if there is any work done within the Jewish community to create an alternative organization or leadership that's willing to confront the World Zionist Organization or the State of Israel. You talk about how American Jews themselves are, they're not, like, there's a difference between them and the Israelis. And I think, we've said since October 7th that the way to kind of push the Americans is America has to be dragged. And do you find that, like, within this alternative leadership, that the Israeli Jew has to be dragged by their compatriots, their international Jewish compatriots? Yeah, that's my question. Yeah.
Great. Now, I need to say one thing about what's happening in America. First of all, I mean, Simone Zimmerman's Jewish Currents piece is very good on this. But about the institutions. The Jewish institutions have not been responsive to the really big change in American Jewish opinion. And in fact, if you ask, like, I think that American Jews are being set up for a wave of anti-Semitism against us. And who's responsible for this? Like, which group is hugely in favor of an aggressive Israeli nationalism? Evangelical Christians. Not us, American Jews. We have some of the strongest opposition to what's going on of American groups. So our and why would evangelicals so, intensely back the horrors that are happening? Obviously there are some religious reasons that are not good for us Jews, because then the Messiah comes back and I understand is supposed to kill us. But it's setting us up. It's setting us up. We're not the ones that are 100% behind Israel's actions in Gaza now. We're very critical of what Israel is doing and has been doing with respect to the Palestinian people, especially younger Jews, of course. Statistics are very clear on this. So, but what we've had a failure of many of the most prominent American Jewish institutions. And it turns out that if you're going to be siding with Christian nationalists, you're siding with people who are going to be anti-Semitic. And you're siding with the far right. And this is what the ADL has found out, that suddenly they can't do this thing where they present themselves as anti-racist because they're siding with the far right. And they're siding with, frankly, anti-Semites. So, of course, people who want the United States, Christian nationalists, are pro an aggressive Jewish nationalism in Israel, because then America can be a Christian state. So, but the main Jewish institutions, I should say October 7th was horrific. The effect it had on me personally was profound, to see so many Jewish people murdered, innocent Jewish people murdered. So I can understand why there was a time of difficulty. I had that myself. It was probably my most difficult moment with regard to these tilting into, okay, we just have to protect ourselves. And so I understand that. And I had anger against people who were immediately, being like, I do not like Hamas in any way. I hate them. But so I think there was an understandable period of time where it was not before, but American Jewish organizations have, I think, aligned themselves with anti-Semitism. And actually, it's protective of American Jews to recognize that these are crimes, to prevent our liberal ideals of free speech from being attacked in the name of protecting us, which is like, as Timothy Snyder said in one piece, I have never known a point of history where universities and free speech, where open discourse in universities was taken to be a threat to Jews. So the whole structure looks anti-Semitic to me. And it looks like, to me, that the ADL is in cahoot, is helping anti-Semitism against my people in America. Okay. So now how to develop, I think there are alternative structures. I think folks like, obviously there are heroic people like Simone Zimmerman and Peter Beinart.
You're next, and then you, and then you.
Yeah, so I really feel for the position a lot of the Jewish people are in, who are obviously vehemently against what the Israeli government is doing, like yourself. We've talked a little bit about institutions, but I do feel like the Jewish people have an important role to play in this time, as you've alluded to as well, especially in a situation where the term anti-Semitism has been weaponized, right? So the same facts coming from a Jewish colleague of mine is received very differently than, say, it is from me, a Muslim American. And what practical steps do you think that the Jewish people who are in that position can take to counter this, especially in a time when we're seeing that a lot of change is coming from the people rather than the institutions?
Yeah, great question. It's sort of connected to the question that I just addressed. I mean, I think, first of all, we have to, first of all, the main focus should be on Palestinians, because this is a genocide of Palestinians. So, but I think it's very important, but I think for two reasons. First of all, it's very important for many of us Jews to be speaking openly about this. First, because saying this is not us that's doing this. This is not what we stand for. It's just there for our children and our, my child goes to a Jewish day school. I in no way, shape, or form do I want his Judaism to be connected to these horrors that Israel is perpetrating on Palestinian people. So, maybe we have to create our own institutions, but we have to, I think we have to challenge, we have to represent for this liberal Jewish tradition. And we have to remind people of what we went through, the apartheid we went through in Europe, not just the Holocaust, but we weren't allowed in cities. We weren't allowed, the kind of thing that we're doing to Palestinians well before the Holocaust. Well before Gaza, now the genocide of Gaza, it's the kind of thing that we went through in Europe well before the Holocaust. So drawing those parallels between the kind of apartheid under Christianity, the pogroms, which looks very similar to what's happening in the West Bank, like the pogroms under Tsarist Russia. I think this is, and just reminding each other, and then preparing, and then pointing out that we are being set up for a wave of anti-Semitism against us. Because if we're going to be connected to this attack on democracy, if democracy is being destroyed in our name, and I would appeal to Jewish self-interest, and that's what I urge people to do. Like, the ADL is not acting in the Jewish self-interest at all. The reverse. They're acting in the interest of anti-Semites.
Next.
Thank you, Dr. Stanley, for your talk. My question is sort of related to your family history. So at the time your family arrived to the United States after World War II, I imagine the largest segment of American Jewry did not experience interwar Europe or the traumas in the lead up to World War II and the Holocaust. Do you think the the traumas and experiences of Jews in their ancestral communities and what was the Pale of Settlement or the interwar nation states in Central Europe, were they mutually recognizable and intelligible among the U.S. Jewish community? And if you could tell us about your family's experience with that.
That's a great question. My mother was raised Orthodox Jewish in Brooklyn. She's 8 when she came. And so she lived like the community I grew up in when we visited my cousins. Those are the only, my mother lost 7 uncles and all her first cousins. So it's just her and my aunt and their 4 kids. And so my holidays were spent in Brooklyn in this Orthodox Jewish community, surrounded by older Polish Holocaust survivors who were drinking like grain liquor. They were Poles, they never speaking Polish and Yiddish. So I think they had their own internal, Orthodox Judaism, very intense Orthodox, very sort of religious Orthodox Judaism is its own thing. And so it was difficult for me, they have either you're Orthodox Jewish or you're not in that community. As far as my father is concerned, he, maybe I should just answer it as myself. I've always found, since I was raised with the Holocaust as sort of a central defining feature of my life and childhood, that American Jews were weird. Having not, they were a little too American for me. They were a little too, they weren't like marked by that experience. And that's what I think about Palestinians, that, it's not PTSD, it's ongoing trauma of the most horrific variety. And even though I grew up in a middle-class home, I still had that, intense kind of thing about talking about the past. So I know about those. And American Jews always felt weird to me because they were so happy and, they didn't have that defining thing. But I don't recall, because my mother's family just stayed in Brooklyn in this Orthodox Jewish community. My mother remains the only woman in her family ever to go to college. And my father was a sort of leftist not leftist, but a sociology professor, working on colonialism and East Africa. And these were different. I can only sort of report my own relation to American Jewry, which has a different connection to events like the Holocaust than I do.
We have to go to the next question. Go ahead.
Thank you so much again for coming back to the US and speaking here today. In her books, Twilight of Democracy and Autocracy, Inc., Atlantic staff writer Anne Applebaum talks about the tendency of autocratic leaders to ally themselves with each other. And in your book, you talk about the construction of the rhetorical concept of the mythic past.
Yeah.
And so looking at the separate responses to genocidal rhetoric in relation to Ukraine versus Gaza, how do you conceptualize the American construction of this mythic past leading to separate conclusions?
Different reaction to Ukraine
Yes.
versus different reaction. Yeah, I know. Like you never get your talks canceled when you're talking about Russian aggression in Ukraine. And in fact, you can be kind of openly anti-Russian in a way that Russians, it's just like there's just no issue in like attacking Russians and Russian nationalists or Russia for what they're doing. There's no issue. And it's like free points. And Russians have to just suck it up. Like you meet a Russian in your class and you say you guys are killing people for no reason whatsoever. It's horrible. That's nobody's talking. That's not like nobody's like, oh my God, Russophobia. The concept of Russophobia, even though there has been rightly a lot of critique of Russia, because it is, let's not forget, horrific what they're doing in Ukraine. And people are forgetting how many people have been killed in Ukraine. There's no issue. Nobody's talking about Russophobia. you don't have talks banned because of Russia phobia. So it's an obvious, clear difference. It just simply isn't that brave. It's brave to go to Ukraine, but it's not brave to condemn Russia. So, right, I'm just emphasizing like, I'm not aware of Anne Applebaum criticizing Israel. I mean, obviously she criticizes Netanyahu, I'm sure, because of, but taking a stand on this, it seems to me, if you criticize Russia, you've got to criticize Israel.
But many liberals don't do that, right?
I know, it's
So
astonishing.
the question is, how do we explain the general silence of many people who are very outspoken on these human rights issues? Like,
It's mind-boggling.
I mean, even someone like Samantha Power, right?
Yeah.
Miss Genocide, who writes this great book
Right.
on the importance of the United States taking a stand against genocide. Dead silence on Gaza.
Well, if you talk about Gaza, you're cut off from various opportunities,
Yeah.
various, because, and not, I think, because of we Jewish people, but I think of some kind of structure. I think I think there's a structure of the multiracial far right. Like there are far right Black Americans, there are far right Latino Americans, there are far right Jewish Americans, but generally we're not a far right community, and we're not, so it's obviously the case. I mean, by the Russia phobia versus, you complain, you protest against Israel, and you risk being called an anti-Semite. You protest against Russia, no one is going to charge you with Russia phobia. So I think there are obviously these structures. I think that the far right is cynically using anti-Semitism to destroy democracy. And they're not cynically using it. They're not cynically using Russia. They would use Russophobia if it could work.
Yeah.
But
Yes.
too many Americans are already sort of programmed
Yeah.
towards Russophobia anyway.
Yeah.
So
It gets to the next sort of related question here from St. Joseph University is, how do you push back here in the United States against these increased attempts at censorship and silencing in an academic context? What strategies do we use? I mean, so the people in St. Joseph are facing exactly what we're talking about.
I have enormous privilege.
Yeah.
I can say whatever the hell I want.
Right.
And I do say whatever the hell I want. And I've never in my life shied back from saying whatever the hell I want. If you don't have that privilege, well, probably you can't say whatever the hell you want. So those of us who do have that privilege, I'm really critical of those of people who are in my position, who have this remarkable privilege
Say nothing.
and say nothing. I'm just,
Yeah.
I would say whatever your, and then it's very tricky. You live in an authoritarian country. America is not a democracy. So I live in a democracy. So my life is just different than your life. You guys have to figure out how to deal with living in authoritarianism. And that will be true, I think, for a very long time, or maybe America will always be authoritarian from now on. So I think there's a question of how to deal with to live in an authoritarian country. I feel in Canada, I might lose friends, but I can still say whatever I want.
Yeah.
But in authoritarianism, you guys have to, generally your world shrinks so you can still go to the restaurant, but you just can't, under authoritarianism, say whatever you want. And I think right now, the fascist forces that rule your country, that rule my country, are using the topic of Israel just as a method to target free speech and democracy, and that's anti-Semitic, because then they're going to say, "Hey, we weren't the ones who destroyed democracy." So how to fight back against that is tough, because I did think, if I'm going to continue to be me, like my 14-year-old, friend of mine was trying to convince him that, why don't you move to China? Like, America's authoritarian too. my 14-year-old's like, my dad would not survive a minute in China.
Right.
So I think, at a certain point, when you live under authoritarianism, as you guys do, you do have to watch what you say, because that's what authoritarianism is.
Yeah.
So I'm not recommending that anyone go out and challenge, and go out. If I was speaking in China, I would be like, go out and challenge Xi. I
Yeah.
mean, you live under authoritarianism.
Yeah. Let's take some questions at the back. We have about 10 minutes left. Yeah, sir, you're next.
Thank you. Could you talk a little bit about Israeli Jews? What is the public debate going on there? What percentage are more justice-minded? And are Jews in the United States trying to influence and create more space for a more progressive Jewish Israeli community?
So I don't, the Israeli Jews I know are very committed to justice on these topics. I guess I do know some Israeli Jews who are, I should say my mother has very different views than I do on these topics, but she still loves me dearly. I don't talk about this with her. I have some ignorance that will not enable me to really respond to your question. Honestly, I've always been an American Jew. I've always thought of Israel as a different country. I've always thought, as Molly Crabapple says, here where I live, this is my country. I've always thought of myself as American. So Israelis have seemed to me like different people. A lot of them come from my background, and that's a point of connection, but their whole lives they've lived in a country whose social and political situation is so foreign to me that that I don't know anything. I've only been there once.
Okay. Yeah, you're next. Yep.
So just two very, very quick things. First, you mentioned that you weren't necessarily in favor of states that had a unified church and state. Are you willing to apply this broadly to not just a Israeli state, but also a Christian state or a
Yes,
Muslim state, and also just
absolutely. In fact, I've spent my life complaining about even vague hints of that. And when my first job was in the UK, and I got like super annoyed at all of, I would prefer none of that, but I don't mind. Like recently I was arguing with someone I know who was like saying Canada is a Christian state, like Israel is a Jewish state. I'm like, you're just lying to me and yourself if you actually believe that, because in no sense is Christianity as connected to Canada as Judaism is. It's not baked into the property laws, etc. I am incredibly opposed to Christian nationalism. I'm incredibly opposed to anyone saying that my country, the United States, is fundamentally Christian in a way, shape, form. It's a secular, liberal democracy. And actually, Israel was formed that way, but it has deeply betrayed that in its structure of its laws and much else.
Yeah. I have to ask you a question before we end on what's happening in New York and Zoran Mamdani.
Yeah.
It's the big issue of the day, and the question of anti-Semitism and liberalism.
And affordability.
And affordability, yeah. So there was a petition that was circulated. This was published in the Washington Post the other day. More than 1,000 rabbis, cantors, and rabbinical students from around the country signed a petition to oppose, quote, rising anti-Zionism and its political normalization. And they highlighted Mamdani for being part of the problem here. The petition read, quote, when public figures like New York mayoral candidate Zoran Mamdani refuse to condemn violent slogans, denies Israel's legitimacy, and accuse the Jewish state of genocide, they delegitimize the Jewish community and encourage and exacerbate hostility toward Judaism and Jews, the petition said.
Connecting Jews to genocide is like this idea that who is connecting Jews to genocide? It sounds like they're connecting Jews to genocide. They're saying that if you deny that Israel's committing a genocide in Gaza, you are the logic is torturous then. I mean, you cannot Jews to genocide if you say that Jews have to support what Israel's doing in Gaza. Jews do not have to support what Israel is doing in Gaza. We just don't. In fact, there's a long tradition of us not supporting genocide. And so, they're connecting Jews to genocide. There's a very long, Zionism is new. There can be Jews who are anti-Zionist. There can be Zionists who are there can be and are Zionists who are anti-genocide. Like just on 100 different issues. It's confused and legitimacy. Israel's a state. It's there. Nobody should be for doing anything to the state of Israel other than trying to make it into a democracy. And giving Palestinians equal rights and making sure Israel doesn't do these things. But it's a state, like many other states. It was born with certain sins, with settler colonialism, but so was Canada. And we have to make sure that apartheid against the Palestinian people ends, and we need some. So the whole thing seems to me a tissue of conceptual confusions. The United States is a what does legitimacy mean? As a liberal, I don't think any state should be connected to an ethnic or religious identity, whether it's Hindu, Christian, Jewish, any identity, Muslim, Palestinian. I don't think there should be a state based on Palestinian identity. All of and liberalism. Because that's what Jews were fighting for, that states not be Christian. So the whole thing seems to me a tissue of conceptual confusions. By the way, I keep on saying that because for philosophers, that's the worst thing to me.
Concepts,
Conceptual confusion. I don't know how to respond to here's this completely conceptually confused, theoretically incoherent critiques.
Great. Jason, this has been wonderful to have you here. We're going to be continuing the conversation tonight at Busboys and Poets, where we're going to be having a conversation on Gaza and the politics of anti-Semitism, very much what we're talking about right now. It's great to have you here. Please join me in thanking Jason. We also have two of his latest books outside for sale if you want to purchase them, and also tonight they'll be on sale at the bookstore. Thanks for coming.